Hello and welcome to the Kubernetes Sig Docs weekly meeting for June 26th, 2018. Let's start by asking if there is anyone attending this meeting for the first time, or maybe the first time in a while.
This is my first time attending the meeting. How's it going?
Great, welcome. Tell us your name and where you are.
Sure, my name is Tim. I'm based in San Francisco. I work at MLab. We host MongoDB databases, and we're kind of using Kubernetes internally. So I'm excited to kind of get more involved with the project. Also signed up to be a doc shadow for the 1.12 release. So excited to help out.
Very cool. Well, welcome. All right, let's move on to updates and reminders. So a reminder that our new APAC-friendly meeting time starts today at 7 p.m. Pacific. And I would like to, we didn't cover it specifically last week. I would like to propose that on fourth Tuesdays that our APAC time be our only time for the Sig Docs weekly meeting. And I can talk about specific reasons if folks want to get into that, but just a sense of whether we need to discuss that or not. Are folks like up or down? How do folks feel about it? Is anybody who thinks that we should have two meetings on fourth Tuesdays? I'm not hearing anybody speak up. Awesome. Okay. So next week is the week of July 4th. It's a US holiday. I know that both myself and Andrew are going to be out on Tuesday next week. So I wish Jared was here. I would ask him if he's going to be around. Actually, do you know if Jared's going to be around? Steve, Misty?
I can find that out really quickly. I just wanted to point out it's also a Canadian holiday in case we have any Canadian contributors on the 1st.
Right, is it Canadian Thanksgiving?
Yep. No, it's Independence Day. Well, I think they call it Canada Day. Yeah, the Thanksgiving is October. It's the same time as Columbus Day.
Gotcha. So it's going to be scant, I suspect, in terms of people who are here. We'll wait for Misty to get word back from Jared Bati, but if Jared is also going to be out, is there anyone who would be interested in running the meeting next week?
I think that Jared is going to be in. Andrew is out. I mean, he could speak for himself. I don't see
Jared's schedule looks like he's out.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, on the calendar.
Oh, interesting, because his calendar is totally full. Oh, yeah, you're right. I see. He has his a little different. It's like set for all day being out. So, yeah, Jared is also out.
Steve, are you going to be in?
I'm planning to be here. I've never run a meeting before, so I would need some coaching on how to do it.
It's easy. Nothing to it.
Okay.
You do need access to you need access to the more juiced Zoom account, I think, to record the meeting, right?
Yes, yeah. So we can cover that. It's pretty straightforward. Great. Well, Steve, if you're willing,
okay.
Great. So Steve will run the meeting next week. There's some happy news. We have two new maintainers for the repo. We have Qiming Tang and Misty Linville, who are now, they have the hat to go along with the job they've already been doing for quite some time. So it's happy news. Qiming is a prolific reviewer and he gives a great deal of love to parts of the Kubernetes doc set that don't otherwise see a lot of love. Misty was just the release meister for 1.11 and did a fantastic job, picked it up sort of midstream. So it is a real joy to have them both on board as maintainers. So yay. All right, let's move on to the agenda. We have kind of the first discussion that we have. I mean, it could well take up the rest of the time, but it's an important question. So, Andrew, do you want to intro this conversation?
Yeah, but do you want to knock off any of the other easier agenda items? Because this may take a while.
Sure. Let's see. Misty, can you give us an update on the state of 1.11?
Yeah, I can. And also we should probably bump the branching discussion to a later meeting. It's not necessary to have it now. And it seems like we have a pretty full agenda. So 1.11 is effectively, the work is effectively done. I have one more PR to make for some feedback that Andrew gave on the current status of the 1.11 stuff as far as like the TOML file and things like that. So I need to make an adjustment there, but all of the features have been documented. Those are all merged. We got lots of improvements in. I would like to, the release is supposed to happen sometime Wednesday. I'm not sure exactly about timing yet. So I would propose that this afternoon I will cut 110 off of master. So I'm encouraging people to review PRs, people who have the power to do that, and get as many fixed PRs into master as we can before that time. Probably not really controversial ones because we don't want to break it right before I cut it. But other than that, thanks everybody for your hard work. It's been an interesting learning experience for me. I think everything's on track, despite the migration and all of the other churn. So I'm pretty impressed with all of us.
Yes, and thank you for the push to close as many PRs into 110 as possible before cutting it. I think that was a really smart idea. So thank you for the update. Let's see, we're going to skip the branching strategy discussion for now. Luke, do you want to talk about the Kubernetes Day 2 proposal?
You know, actually, I think I should probably table that for now. Right now, I'm working about 2/3 of the time on the Prometheus docs and don't quite have the bandwidth for it. But I'll put together like a Google Doc proposal for a future meeting, maybe in about 2 or 3 weeks. Does that sound good?
That sounds good. Okay. Steve, do you want to talk about moving YAML files to a common directory?
Yeah, so we decided last week, I think, that it would make sense to, instead of having YAML files in the same directory as their topic, to put all the YAML files in a common directory. So that work is underway. Qiming is doing it. He's doing it in a sequence of small PRs so that we can evaluate the success in little bits at a time. And there's an example of one of the PRs if anyone wants to take a look at it.
I mean, it seems reasonable to me.
Yeah, I think it'll improve things.
Okay. Any discussion needed on this? One piece, just scanning this PR, one related piece that I would like to surface is YAML files that are specific to translation. Am I remembering that correctly, Steve? That the decision was to have a YAML file directory that was specific to each translation?
That's right, yeah.
As well. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you for the update. And let's do kind of a last call for any discussion, any small items to do before we dive into the larger question of SIG process. Okay, let's move on. And now let's talk about the larger question of how to make sure that docs get created, updated, and or destroyed when code changes happen. And so there's, I guess, two pieces to this question: making sure that docs are current, and discussing whether or not, or discussing how to document doc life or feature lifecycle state, alpha, beta, GA. Andrew, do you want to do an intro?
Yes. So just to give some background to folks. So the steering committee was sort of having a long discussion about this, and it came about because Timothy St. Clair, who sometimes comes to this meeting, is also on the steering committee, and he's part of Cluster Lifecycle, and they were doing kind of an audit of all the docs related to their SIG, and they found that there was a bunch that were missing or out of date or hadn't been created during the cycle. So the question became like, how do we, one, like ensure that documentation is created when features are introduced? Because, you know, there was some many discussion about, like, you know, they were trying to introduce more into the KEPS process so that there's documentation earlier on, but that may not be practical because obviously people like to write the code first, and it may change by the time it's kind of ready to go out. And then they usually will do the documentation then based on what the final version is. So then it was like, you know, what carrots and sticks do we have? Like, should we make this gating process so when things are going from like alpha to beta or something, before we, you know, as a community, let them go to the next stage, they have to have, like, you know, a checklist of things done, including docs. You know, it could also be testing code and other things, but it'd be like sort of like a NASA go no go like checklist. And also Tim Hawken wanted to make the point that we should ask more from the community for this sort of thing. So if we want to make, you know, I don't know, these sort of like stick requirements, you know, that we should solicit the community, say like, this is what we need in order to ensure that the docs are up to date or have been created, or this or that. So I encourage you to watch the video because it's a good discussion, and there's more information than I'm remembering right now. But I think the way I like to think of it is more in terms of like the doc lifecycle, the whole thing, because there's different parts of this, right? And we may address each part a little differently, because in terms of, say, keeping docs up to date, you know, if something is deprecated or stale, like we need a way to kind of look through docs and find those and get rid of them or update them, right? And like we don't, at this time, don't even really have a list of what are all the features that exist and what are their feature states, like what things are in alpha, which things are in beta, which are in GA. So I'd like to, I don't know, this is not going to be, this is more of like a long-term thing, so we have to kind of figure this out, but I'd like to start the discussion now.
Agreed. The link to the video is in the agenda if you haven't already watched it. I +1 to watching it. It's a really valuable discussion. One of the takeaways that I had from the video was that the steering committee is very pro docs, and I think the sense that I got was that they are looking for input from us to tell them what they should be doing. So I think they want guidance, or at least something that they can push back against if they don't necessarily agree with something, but they are very much interested in hearing about best practices and how to proceed. Like what doc gate checks could look like.
Yeah, because right now, you know, we do have sort of a spreadsheet during the release cycle that there's, you know, feature owners are supposed to put it in and then say whether it requires docs or not. But it's kind of late in the process, and they would like this to be a little bit earlier on. There was some talk about, well, what about creating like docs LGTM labels in other repos, like in the code repos? So if, you know, to identify which ones need docs changes or creation like sooner, and then that, you know, empower us to do those, evaluate those PRs and stuff. But I'm kind of wondering like how that would work in practicality, because I mean, we're already sort of overloaded with PRs and issues right now. So like adding other repos for us to kind of monitor, like I feel like is extra overhead. But I'm just wondering like what an efficient process would be like. Does anyone have any thoughts?
So I think one of the things we ought to do is evaluate what's failing with the current spreadsheet model. So you mentioned one thing, it being that we don't get the information in that spreadsheet soon enough. So what other aspects of that are failing? Is that spreadsheet failing to capture certain changes that we should have been aware of? Are people failing to enter in the spreadsheet that their feature needs docs? What are the different ways that it's not working right now?
So a few of the ways that I know is that, one, there's no way to like know for sure that all the features that require docs made it into the spreadsheet. Like from what I remember from the release process, it's like you're always just trying to like check with the SIG leads and everybody to make sure things are in. But a lot of times things still slip in at the last minute. So obviously that's not, it's not definitive. And then another way is it doesn't always track all the things that need to be updated, right? Because there's a lot of times, a lot of those features are new or are being introduced, and they'll get it. But then if something's going from alpha to beta, like what changes, changes were made to the code and the behavior may have changed. So we need to make sure the docs are updated. And then that in the docs, we say that it's moved to beta or going from beta to GA, that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot of that where it doesn't make it into that spreadsheet. Some of them do, but not all of them. There's no way to be sure that it's all in there.
The SIG release team is, they also want this. They want to understand more about feature lifecycle, and I think that they want to track it. I don't know if they have figured out, I don't think it's going to be tracked yet for 112, but it's definitely a priority for them, and I think they're trying to figure out tooling around it. So we're not the only ones that want this.
Sorry, Misty, who's the other folks who are looking to track feature status?
The SIG release team. It was something that I flagged for 111, and it's something that they've been thinking about in general, but I think that they hadn't actually articulated why we needed to know. Also, I think we have really loose definitions in this community, in this project, about what it means to go to beta and what it means to go to GA. So that's also another fly in the ointment. And some parts of a feature will sometimes move to beta, but other parts will still be considered alpha, and it's one feature.
Yeah. So we need some guidelines in terms of like, when something needs docs change. Like how do you tell when something should have a docs change? And then perhaps we should start talking with SIG release and at some point form like a working group with them to do this.
One thing that I want to say, Andrew and I talked about this in private a little bit. If we had a hard line saying that we don't want to document alpha features at all, that makes it harder for us to document beta features because we're starting from a zero foundation, and it also makes it harder for early adopters to test alpha features because it's really hard to exercise something when you have no idea how it's supposed to work.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I also, based on the process though, I would want, but what I also have seen is people build something and they're like, I'm not going to worry about alpha.
Jared, you're really soft.
Oh, I'm sorry. I would worry about engineers kicking stuff over the wall at us at alpha without any context. So if we do document alpha, we need to have very clear guidelines of what we expect from the developers to give to us, including the reasons to use it, why we want to use it, how customers are expected to use it, etc.
I honestly don't understand how, I mean, obviously this happens all the time, but I don't understand how a developer can develop something without having something to develop against, some idea about how it's supposed to work and being able to test those assumptions. So it seems mystifying to me that there's not something. I mean, because not every feature goes into the Kubernetes/features repo, which is sort of, in a way, those feature docs are sort of alpha docs in a way, but not every feature. Like there were a few surprise features in 1.11 that were not listed as features in that repo. And I don't know how they don't have anything they can possibly give us for an alpha feature.
So I know this, I guess just to continue shedding light on the scope of what we're looking at, I noticed from the release process that the consistency and quality of documentation of features that are part of a quarterly release cycle, that docs quality and just the extent of feature documentation isn't always guaranteed. And in my experience so far, very rarely do features get comprehensive review from feature developers or from the relevant SIG owners as to whether all of the functionality in a feature area is current. There's I can find the specific PR, but there's a PR I looked at yesterday. Misty is part of closing PRs against 1.10 before we cut the branch. There was a PR against specifically against Node DNS inheritance, and the docs for Node DNS inheritance are in 3 different places in unrelated feature groups. And as it turns out, the default for the value of default for DNS inheritance is not in fact the default. So it sort of highlighted an example of something that we see in other places in our docs, which is that there doesn't tend to be comprehensive review. So how do we ensure that feature owners, whether that's a SIG, whether that's a particular developer, how do we ensure that feature review happens regularly? And it's very easy. It's much easier to have a gate check on a specific PR in a release cycle. It's very easy to up or down, go no go for a PR in a release cycle. It's much more difficult to go no go or enforce any kind of gate check on ongoing feature accuracy, and I don't know the best way to do that. I wish Jennifer was here. SIG cluster lifecycle over the course of this past release decided to train wreck their docs and say all of the docs that we own for the docs for all of the features we own, we are considering these end of life. All of these need review, and I know that Jennifer had a very mixed experience with that, but I suspect that we could learn a great deal about what to do or how to go forward with that kind of comprehensive feature ownership and feature review. Because the way that we do things now, I don't think is the way that we continue to do them. I don't think that we can, I don't think that fixing the quarterly release process is enough. I don't think that's going to be enough to fix the question of overall quality in the documentation. So that's another thing I think it's important to look at. With the quarterly release process, the stick that we have is very clear. It's a very binary go no go. But what carrots and sticks do we have with an entire SIG ownership or feature ownership?
Well, I'm not sure how we can incentivize the SIGs specifically, but a couple ideas of things that we could do to help would be one, like maybe adding like a SIG in the front matter. So we know like every doc should have sort of a SIG owner. And then maybe we can work with the SIGs to kind of do, I don't know, like annual audits or whatever, or every 6 months. And then like all the ones that are related to them, they can kind of look through and make sure that they're, you know, not stale. And then identify the ones that need to be updated or removed. Another thing we could do is to surface the last updated date. Because we had a Hugo template meeting this morning unrelated to Kubernetes, but there is a feature where Hugo can look at the commit date from Git, and you can use that in the page. So we can always identify like you know, when these pages were last updated, and the ones that, you know, haven't been updated for, you know, a year or two or something, we can, you know, identify those more easily.
If nothing else, I think that should be in a really subtle watermark thing at the bottom of the page, along with the commit that last updated a given page. I've seen that done before, and it's super helpful, if nothing else, just for understanding context about a page. It can be really subtle. It can even actually be like in the source in a comment instead of being visible on the page, but I think that's really helpful. And we can also run reports on that.
Yeah, I think visible on the page is good, because users want to know that too.
Yeah, I like that idea of making that visible on the page, but we'll have to be aware that that can fool us, because every time someone fixes a typo, it will update that page, and we could then think that it's up to date when it really isn't. Yeah,
that's true.
I think another thing we can do is be more aggressive about pulling out old information. We have a lot of like admonitions and stuff that reference versions that are not supported anymore. And I think in general, as we go forward, to encourage people to use the feature state Hugo shortcode instead of putting that stuff in the pros. I've been in the 111 PRs, I've been pretty hard line about that, about like moving that version specific information out of paragraphs and into the feature state tag when I can, because that's searchable. That's really easily searchable, as opposed to just some random sentence in a paragraph.
Agreed. So I like the idea of Andrew, that you proposed of having of including a SIG in the front matter. I think that's clearer than individual owners, because people come and go, and it's well, okay, so individual reviewers, I think, are still really valuable to include in the front matter. But I mean, what would we? Maybe this is a little bike sheddy, but like, what would we include? Would we include the SIG as? I guess we could just include the SIG alias as a reviewer. You know, whatever like PR review alias a SIG has. Include that in the reviewers section of the front matter.
I mean, because that was actually Steve's idea, because that came out of discussion of like the original purpose of the owners tags in the front matter was to know who had written it, and then like, you know, they would be in charge of knowing whether the doc is up to date. But then we changed that whole thing because now we have approvers and reviewers instead of owners. Yeah. So maybe we should still have something that's like authors, so we know who the original author was, or people who contributed or something, in addition to the SIG. But if not, at the very least, we should have it tagged with the SIG.
So yeah, there are a couple of ways we could do it. We, like Zach just said, we could have among the reviewers the name of a SIG, or the name of some group that is, you know, SIG lifecycle reviewers, or we could have a dedicated field in the front matter. I think this is probably my preference, in the front matter, have a dedicated field called SIG. And in most cases there'd be one, but in some cases there could be two SIGs associated with a topic. I don't think we want to list individual authors, because that just changes so quickly that as soon as we list an author, 6 months later, that person's not on that feature anymore.
Agreed. So, I mean, these are good pieces for best practices, but I'm also thinking about like the next discussion that we have with SIG architecture, like what are the questions they're going to ask? And I think they are going to ask about carrots and sticks, and how can we get SIG docs closer to feature development? How can we get writers involved in gate checks inside of feature development repos? So I guess if folks have ideas about that, I would love to hear it. I mean, I have my own ideas, but I mostly just shoot down those ideas.
So just spitballing here, some carrots and sticks I'm just thinking of is, for carrots, maybe we can like, you know, if they've cleaned up their docs and stuff for a particular SIG, maybe we can help highlight their stuff in the release notes, you know? And then for sticks, maybe it's like, you know, we have a policy for if something hasn't been you know, updated or checked in, I don't know, like X number of months or a year or something, that we may automatically deprecate it and just pull it out of our doc set, you know? I mean, that may be kind of harsh and over the line, but I'm just thinking of possibilities here.
Say that one more time, Andrew.
Or, you know, we can have a policy of like, you know, if a particular doc hasn't been touched, you know, updated or, you know, reviewed in like a year or 2 years or whatever, that we automatically just deprecate it and pull it out of our doc set, you know. So the incentive for them is that to make sure that their docs, like the SIG, each SIG has their docs up to date. Otherwise, they slowly disappear.
I think that's worthwhile. I think I think we would have to be very specific about what review looks like in that case, because it would be very easy for, you know, say like we have say like we work with test infra and we get like FADAbot 2000, and FADAbot 2000 specifically monitors updates to pages. So like what constitutes an update to a page? Is it a simple typo fix? Is it a trivial commit and undo? Is the mere presence of a PR enough to trigger that? I think we want to make sure that
LGTM. It's an LGTM from someone designated as a tech reviewer.
Yeah, but it's got to be a full review of the page.
Right. Yeah, I mean, but if they go in, if we write, you know, if we notify them and say your document is going to be pulled from the doc set unless you do a review and give it an LGTM by this date, and if they go in and give a review, an LGTM by that date, and in the PR it's explained that that is a technical review from the SIG, then at that point it's on them. You know, if they haven't done due diligence, it's on them.
Mm-hmm. I like that idea. It does enforce a technical review, like, and it works. It would work with like surfacing the feature or the last update date on a page to make sure that. I just see it working nicely with that.
Yeah. And this is why
I think it's a reasonable way to go forward.
Yeah, I like Misty's suggestion that where we show the last updated information at the bottom of the page, we also have a link to the commit or the PR, so that if somebody wants to say, oh, last updated, well, what kind of update was it? They can immediately see that this was a thorough technical review or it was just a typo.
Agreed. So yeah, I think it would be worthwhile like to approach test infra or Eric Feda in particular and say, hey, we'd like some bot functionality that specifically addresses this kind of review.
You know, we talked a while back about what kind of labels we want, and we decided that we would use the existing labels for our purposes. We would use approve to mean approved by a writer, and we would use LGTM to mean technical review. And at the time, we talked about whether we wanted dedicated labels for that. You know, maybe we should have a label for technical LGTM and a label for writing LGTM. So we might want to revisit that discussion if we're going to do something like this to try to ensure that we have a technical LGTM.
I think that may be worthwhile.
Yeah, I just added a link if you want to see. Look on the Hugo website, like if you scroll to the bottom of their docs, they have that kind of watermark. It says like the last updated date and then a link to the commit.
Thank you for the link, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, it could be any page in their doc set, but that was the first one I clicked on.
Oh, that's handy. Yeah, right at the bottom. There's, yeah, that's not especially subtle, but it's very easy to identify what's going on there. So other thoughts about process, about carrots and sticks, and about ensuring that that review works well at the individual PR level and also works well at the overall quality level.
I do think we should work with Sig Release to create some of these gates so that, you know, docs have to be in at these different phases.
Agreed. Other thoughts? It's a lot to think about. So what I'm going to suggest is that we revisit this, probably not next week, but in 2 weeks. Let's actively think about how we can address the technical challenge, the cultural challenge of getting docs reviews earlier and more comprehensively in the release cycle and or ambiently. Like, you know, I like the idea of having at least a minimal annual review, but I also like the idea of making sure that like the release process works better from a doc standpoint. So let's sit on it. Let's think about ideas or something that's like, wait, we didn't even talk about. Like, make a note and let's revisit this in 2 weeks, as I feel like this is too important to let go. Okay.
And then once we have sort of enough ideas on the table, I'd be willing to sort of put together a doc outlining all the sort of different areas and possible ways we can address it. And then we can kind of decide on which ones we want to implement. And then so we can have sort of like an action item list. And then maybe talk with Sig Release and form like a working group if we want to make changes to the overall release process.
I also think it would be a good idea once we have that, once we have a list of concrete action items, that we go to the next SIG architecture meeting or the steering committee meeting and talk about and be ready to respond and continue the discussion with the steering committee.
You know, one concrete action item we might be able to look at right away is just doing the exercise of seeing if it even makes sense to assign a SIG to each topic. You know, as we do that exercise, we might be surprised to find that it's not so easy to identify a single SIG for each topic, or we might find out that actually it is. You know, there's this nice alignment, and then after we have that mapping made, then we can write to the SIGs and say, these are the topics that we think, you know, you own. Do you agree?
Yeah, and I suspect there's a bunch of docs where, yeah, multiple SIGs, because there's a lot of different sections. There's some docs that are really long. So I suspect there's a bunch that we may want to split up, or like, yeah, we have to work with several different SIGs for a particular doc.
I think we may encounter as well some sort of SIG no man's land, like specifically for DNS inheritance. I was thinking yesterday about like which SIG do I assign to this? Is it node? Is it cluster lifecycle? And it might be both or neither, depending on which specific aspect of DNS inheritance, which specific aspect of the mechanics that we're talking about. So yeah, that's a really good idea, Steve. Like maybe like with every PR that we touch, as part of reviewing it, do the thought exercise or the actual exercise of assigning a SIG to the front matter. Does that seem like a reasonable approach? Yes.
Yeah.
So yes, and that'll get us 10% of the way there. But at some point, we'll have to just plow through the whole thing.
Yeah. That's also not necessarily something that it's not something that we necessarily need to do alone. I think we can also invite other SIGs, like if we go to the community meeting and say, hey, other SIGs, please tag yourself. Like here's an example PR of what tagging yourself in the front matter looks like. Go through and tag the docs that you think are yours, and that might be another 10%. Okay. All right. Anything else that we need to talk about this today? Okay, let's revisit this in 2 weeks. Okay, we've got 15 minutes left. Last call. That's the SIG meeting. Thanks, everybody.
Have a good July 4th.
Discussion today. Happy 4th.
Yeah.